Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of In Conversation With. Today, we're joined by Professor Jenny Gore. Jenny Gore is a Laureate Professor in the School of Education at the University of Newcastle, where she was Dean of Research and Head of School for 6 years. Jenny has been Director of the Teachers and Teaching Research Centre since its inauguration in 2003. She has led numerous large-scale studies using a wide range of methodological approaches and theoretical perspectives. Jenny's educational and research interests consistently centre on quality and equity. Her recent research has focused on understanding good teaching, conceptually and practically, investigating system-wide pedagogical reform, providing meaningful and effective professional development, and enhancing student outcomes from schooling. And we're delighted to be joined by Jenny today. Jenny, it's over to you and you're very welcome.
Thanks very much, Gavin. It's fabulous to be a part of this really important series, and I appreciate the invitation. I'm going to be talking today about the research I've been doing on quality teaching and quality teaching rounds, and in the time we have available, really just providing an overview of that work. It's a really large program of research, so I'll do a rapid fire version of it and provide some links and things at the end so that you can follow up on anything you'd like to afterwards. This quote, it's something I said at a lecture for the Australian Council of Ed Leaders late last year, and I was asked to talk a little bit about hope and where we find hope in education at the moment, which of course is a big challenge with all that has faced people in education and faced the world really over the last few years. But I think this is a really important statement that if we want to seek improvement, it's not just about, hoping for it or dreaming of a better future. We actually have to find ways of working towards a collective vision of the future, which involves finding paths of action that leaders can actually take. So hope, we can ask people to be hopeful. That doesn't necessarily help. And that's sort of a bit like, don't worry, be happy, or every little thing's going to be all right. And then there's also the hope that is born of despair, that really sometimes keeps people in very awful positions. The practical kind of hope is hope that's based on evidence that things can be different. That's when we really feel hope. We can see a way forward. And I suppose a lot of my work focuses on education as the way forward. And I have provided a link there to that lecture, which is also now published. But I believe that the way forward for many of our challenges in education is really to focus on teaching, because teaching is ultimately what makes a difference. Teaching is the core of teachers' work. Teaching is what leaders need to care about if we're really going to see improvement. And so this statement, I think, is also a really useful one from Vivienne Robinson and her colleagues, who say the more leaders focus their influence, their learning and their relationships with teachers on the core business of teaching and learning, the greater their likely influence on student outcomes. It used to be enough once upon a time that with professional development, we wanted to make a difference for teachers. And at the lowest level, we wanted teachers to feel good about the professional development. Ideally, it made some kind of difference in terms of their learning or their practice. But these days, there's real pressure on professional development or professional learning, whatever you prefer to call it, over there, wherever you're watching this from. There's real pressure on ensuring that the professional development experiences that we provide for teachers actually have an impact on student outcomes. And of course, academic outcomes are the most common measure. But it's not just those academic outcomes that most of us care about. It's also social and emotional outcomes. And again, those sorts of issues have been really brought to the fore over the last few years of the pandemic, with levels of mental ill health and stress and distress for teachers and for students. Somehow I feel like I missed a click there. All good, back on track. So what I'm going to be mainly talking about is our work on quality teaching rounds. And quality teaching rounds is fundamentally a collaborative approach to teacher professional development that really brings teachers together to learn from each other and improve their practice. And it's all founded on something that we call the quality teaching model. And I will just bring up a version of the quality teaching model. Effectively, this was created in 2003 on the back of the work that Fred Newman and his colleagues had done on authentic pedagogy in the United States. And by the way, I heard that just this week, Fred Newman has passed away a couple of days ago. But his idea that was partly a response to constructivism. It was a concern that perhaps we were going too far down the path of experiential learning and losing sight of the importance of having intellectual challenge and rigor and depth in our learning experiences. So the work on authentic pedagogy sits underneath this. And effectively what the quality teaching model is an expansion of authentic pedagogy. And if anyone has spent time in Queensland, Australia, it's also a refinement of a model that we developed for Education Queensland, which was called productive pedagogy. They all have the same intellectual lineage. They're concerned about the quality of learning for students and very much concerned about equity. So the model has 3 dimensions, and these are derived from research on what is good teaching, but also derived from hours, thousands of hours of classroom observation. And we concluded also through the statistical modelling that was done here that there were 3 key dimensions to quality teaching. And if teachers learn nothing else from the work that we do with them, we want them to be mindful of the intellectual quality, challenge, depth, rigour, whatever synonym you want to use there, the intellectual quality of every learning experience, the quality of the learning environment. In some schools where welfare concerns are so great, the focus is often on supporting students. This dimension draws attention to the fact that we need to also support student learning. It's not enough just to support them and care for them and hope to make them safe and happy at school. We also need to attend to their learning. And thirdly, we need to try and make learning significant where possible, meaningful to kids, so they can see the value of their learning beyond just because they're in school. So the detail is here, and I'm not going to have time to go into all the detail, but basically these are the 6 elements that we look at underneath the dimension of intellectual quality. We don't expect every element to be present at a high level. What we're looking for is high levels of every dimension in every learning experience. So in essence, teachers need to think about 3 things. How do I increase the intellectual quality here? How do I ensure a quality learning environment? And how can I make learning more significant? What we're dealing with here, for example, with the idea of deep knowledge is, are we dealing with key concepts and the relationships with them? By the way, this doesn't dictate a particular style of teaching. You can work in a very traditional classroom and still lift the intellectual quality, the quality learning environment, the significance, or you can work in an inquiry-oriented, problem-based, cooperative, collaborative kind of classroom environment. But are we, the students, are we all in the classroom dealing with big ideas and their relationships? Are we providing opportunities for students to demonstrate their understanding? You know, if we just do multiple choice tests, we don't know what students understand, for example. Are we recognising that knowledge itself has been socially constructed and therefore is open to question? When is it helpful for students to be mindful that there is no single right answer? Sometimes there is, of course, but, you know, what's the meaning of this poem is not the same as what is the answer of 3 + 4. So when is it helpful to look at the origins of knowledge, the social construction of knowledge? Higher order thinking, you know, we all are very familiar with. It's been a buzzword over the last few decades. But part of our point here is that you can have higher order thinking about meaningless crap, to put it bluntly. So it's not just the quality of the thinking, it's the quality of ideas that we're concerned with, that we're engaging students with important ideas. Meta language is the idea of unpacking the language so that it's if you like the meta word Metacognition is thinking about thinking, metadata, layers of data. So here we're talking about meta-language, language about language, unpacking the language so students don't get left behind because they've missed out on some subtlety or nuance of the disciplinary language we're using. And the idea of substantive communication about not just having that initiate, respond, evaluate style of interaction in classrooms where we ask questions a lot and kids answer them and we tell them whether they're right or wrong, but really extending the conversation with students and asking questions like, can you say more? Does someone want to add to that? Extending it. The idea of quality learning environment, we talk about explicit quality criteria. So we're not just telling students what to do, which teachers are very good at. That's our bread and butter. But telling students what counts as good work. And that really important question, what does a good one look like? Whether you're dealing with a kindergarten child learning to form a letter or a PhD student trying to write a thesis, what does a good one look like can help all students to potentially get there. It's a really big equity issue because often the kids who do well in school are the ones who've already figured out, the ones who are already doing well. When we talk about engagement, and it's one of the most frequent words, let's put it that way, used in education. We want kids to be engaged, but it means different things to different people. What we mean here is serious investment in the work. And that looks different for different students and in different classrooms. But it's not that passive engagement waiting for the bell to go that we're talking about. We're talking real engagement. High expectations, we're talking about that students engage in challenging work, challenging for them, and the whole zone of proximal development we all know about is part of the thinking there. But we also too often perhaps, lower our expectations of students, particularly students who come from sometimes more disadvantaged backgrounds. So it's about one of my colleagues says students sink to the occasion. They also rise to the occasion, but let's give them a chance to rise by supporting them. Social support is making sure classrooms are warm, supportive environments where kids will take risks, will have a go, will engage with each other and support each other and the teacher. Self-regulation is about minimising the time that's spent on behaviours so we can maximise the time spent on instruction or teaching and learning. And student direction is really a question of when is it helpful to give students some control over the direction of the lesson. As a former physical education teacher, it's not appropriate when I'm teaching the javelin. You will stand behind the line and not move. It's not explore the javelin kind of lesson. So it's about when is it helpful to give students some input, some control, so that they feel more engaged. And you see that these are not elements that you just pick a couple from and focus on. This is a model of good teaching, and we always look at the 18 elements. And in fact, we have teachers engage in a coding process. There's a 1 to 5 scale for each of these elements. And we always code all 18 elements on the 1 to 5 scale. And that takes about 20 minutes the first time teachers do it and about 10 minutes thereafter. Those codes or numbers remain confidential to the group of teachers who are creating them, by the way. So we create safe spaces for teachers to do this kind of analytical work in relation to the model. The third dimension, ideas like making sure we incorporate students' background knowledge, not just their out-of-school knowledge, not just their previous school knowledge, but also what they bring. And of course, in this information-rich world, students bring so much to every learning situation. So it's about checking in and building on that. Cultural knowledge is making sure we bring in non-dominant cultural knowledge where it's appropriate to do so. And we mean that in terms of race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, religion, age, disability, all of those major markers of difference in society. Knowledge integration is the idea of connecting the pieces. Jim Bean, a colleague in the United States, says that kids receive the curriculum like a jigsaw puzzle, and we never give them the box with the picture on the lid. There is no single box we could give them, but can we connect some of the pieces to help enrich their learning? Inclusivity is all about who's in the classroom, and that's about ensuring that no matter what the diversity of the classroom, that students are all engaged in the work of the lesson. So we don't have if you like, to use old gender binaries. We don't have girls engaged and boys disengaged. We don't have our students with language backgrounds other than English sitting in a corner doing something unrelated to the learning. It's about being truly inclusive. Connectedness is connecting to the world beyond the classroom so students can see some value in what they're learning, and narrative is using stories to help enrich the learning experience. And of course, narratives have been used since the beginning of time for powerful learning, and we all know that when someone tells a story, it's often more engaging than just giving definitions. And when I run through that model, usually I tell a whole lot of stories, but I'm just mindful of the time here. So with that model, we've been able to look at some questions like, what is the relationship between the quality of teaching on the vertical axis on a 1 to 5 scale and school level advantage? ICSEA is the index of community and socio-educational advantage. So high is at the far right, low or poor schools at the far left. And we were really interested in, do poorer schools deliver poorer quality teaching? What we've found here, where every dot is a lesson, we've got poor schools on the left, middle range in the middle, and wealthier government schools on the right. What we see is that there is a small statistically significant relationship between quality of teaching and school ICSEA or school level advantage, but it's very much leveraged down by the bottom group of schools. Some people are quick to blame teachers for this. They say, oh, well, it's, you've got poorer quality teachers, you can't attract the right teachers to those schools. We actually would say it's more to do with the conditions in those schools that actually make the efforts of many teachers quite heroic in the face of some of the challenges that they're dealing with. But also when we do quality teaching rounds, our professional development approach in those schools, the teachers there lift the quality of their teaching just as they do in the other schools. Teachers are capable of great teaching. We just need to create the conditions and provide the supports that will enable them to deliver that. Another really interesting question we've looked at is the relationship between quality of teaching and years of experience. Again, every purple dot here, some of which are not highly visible, is a lesson. We've looked on the 1 to 5 scale on the vertical axis, years of experience from 0 to more than 24 years on the horizontal axis. And this paper is actually about to be published in the next week or so. What we found is no significant differences in the quality of teaching as measured by our 18-element model by years of experience, which is quite a shocking finding to many people. Although when you really dig into the literature, it's not all that uncommon to find this. And even when people do find differences, depending on the measure and so on, they often find growth in the first 3 years and then a plateau. What we have found here, the white whisker plots, they all kind of overlap, which means there's no statistically significant differences between them. I think there's two main explanations for this result. Either we in universities are doing a better job of preparing graduates who are ready to get in there and deliver high quality lessons. And I think there is some truth to that. There's been so much reform to initial teacher education. I think that, we could argue that perhaps graduates these days enter with a range of skills that may not have been the case when I graduated with a teaching degree. The other major explanation is that most teachers are not receiving professional development that has an impact on their pedagogy, on their fundamental approach to teaching. In Australia, so much professional development is on curriculum assessment, reporting, bullying, cyberbullying, mindfulness, wellness, online teaching, anaphylaxis, and the list goes on. But very little is on pedagogy. And there has been a kind of emerging consensus about effective professional development as needing to be content-based. We actually also have a paper published which challenges that emerging consensus on effective PD and say that pedagogy-based professional development is and can be very important for achieving growth. And it can be really important across a whole school, because when you focus on pedagogy, you can bring teachers together from different grades, different stages, different faculties, and that actually is a lot more scalable often than professional development that requires us to just bring together for example, all of the maths teachers or all of the kindergarten teachers. Now, just having a model of pedagogy, we realised was not enough. And so we spent time researching, well, how do we work with this model in a way that's actually going to be productive and powerful for teachers and engage teachers? So we trialled, and I'll show you a bit of detail on the study in a minute. We trialled this process we call quality teaching rounds. It has 4 parts to it. We try to do these quality teaching rounds during the school day because we believe that giving teachers the time out of class when they're fresh, not at 3 p.m. or 4 p.m. when they're exhausted, to do this work together during the day is actually really important for teacher professional development. And a set of quality teaching rounds takes 4 whole days, usually spread over a school term. 4 teachers come together and engage in these processes. So first, they read something. One of them selects. It can be a YouTube clip, a newspaper article, a policy document, an academic paper, whatever. They read something and they discuss it for maybe 30 minutes, 40 minutes, usually the length of a period or a lesson length in a school. The idea here is that they develop some shared knowledge base. So many teachers in schools come together from very different backgrounds, different schools, different universities, and so on, and they rarely get time to sit and discuss educational ideas. So it gives them a shared knowledge base, but it also starts to build the group into a genuinely professional learning community. So we don't use the term PLC or professional learning community as a synonym for group. We're really trying to establish a group of people that are learning together and feeling a real sense of community. Next, one member of the group teaches a lesson, a whole lesson. We believe it's more respectful of teachers and of the teaching learning process to watch whole lessons. So one person teaches a lesson and the other 3 go and watch and take notes. After that, everyone codes the lesson on the 18 elements of the quality teaching model and makes some notes as to why they coded it the way they did. And very importantly, the teacher who taught the lesson codes him or herself. So this is not us giving you feedback on your teaching. It's us using the opportunity to be in each other's classrooms to think about and refine our collective pedagogy. And because the teacher codes him or herself, if I coded myself on a 1, you don't have to worry about giving me a 1 on cultural knowledge because I've coded myself a 1 on cultural knowledge, and I know that I didn't include any non-dominant cultural knowledge in that lesson, and that was for good reason because it wasn't relevant to today's topic. So it takes away some of the kind of power challenges that can get in the way of teachers doing productive analytical work together. Finally, there's an extended discussion where teachers take turns to share how they coded each element and why they coded it the way they did. And we have a turn-taking protocol there. Just excuse me 1 second. So it doesn't matter whether you're the principal in a group, if you've got a head teacher or a principal participating or a beginning teacher, you take your turn to share your code, why you coded it the way they did it, the way you did, what evidence you saw in the lesson, and so on. And what this has the effect of doing is flattening the power hierarchy that often exists in schools. One of the things I love is when we do professional development sessions with teachers, and we usually have a 2-day introduction to the quality teaching rounds process for at least 2 teachers per school. We put them in groups and we have a simulation experience based on a videotape lesson. The conversation begins immediately. Like people start the coding process. I coded deep knowledge of 4 because I thought this was happening. And the next person says, well, I only coded it a 2 because I thought that even though there were some important ideas addressed, they were dealt with quite superficially. And someone else will say, well, I coded it a 5 because I thought there was a really sustained focus on ideas. And I think you did make the connections between them. And once everyone has shared their codes, then they open up the discussion to try and come up with the best code, not because the number matters, but that level of specificity, fine-grained analysis gets to a quality of talk about teaching that we rarely see in other professional development processes. So it's really exciting, actually, to watch teachers engage in this process. And our intention is to empower teachers to do this for themselves. So 2 teachers come to a workshop, which we offer online or face-to-face. That sets them up to go and run this initiative in their schools without us coming in and visiting or doing anything further. We do have some support resources and things, but this is not a money-making exercise. My passion is to make a difference for teachers and for students, and I come from a really long line of teachers, and this is, I guess, a huge part of my life. What we have found, though, with Quality Teaching Rounds is this one initiative of a 2-day workshop for some teachers and 4 days of Quality Teaching Rounds has really broad impact. And so I know in a lot of schools there's so many different initiatives going on, and this thing might make a difference in this subject area, or this thing might make a difference for our beginning teachers. What we find with Quality Teaching Rounds is it has these huge positive effects. So we have evidence that it improves the quality of teaching. It affects teacher morale positively, which in many ways has never been more important than it is now. I don't know what it's like where you are, but certainly in Australia, we have huge challenges with teacher morale at the moment. It has been linked through randomised controlled trials with improvement in student learning outcomes. I'll show you a little bit of data on that in a moment. It improves school culture. We hear from principals and teachers themselves about the enhanced kind of collegiality, the relationships that are built across the school. People who never really used to talk to each other suddenly become, really strong professional colleagues, but they also become friends quite often. I think one of the reasons it works is it honours the complexity of teaching. So much professional development focuses in on one thing at a time. And, there's good reason to do that. Let's improve the quality of our feedback. But teachers in classrooms don't have the luxury to focus just on their feedback because they have to do everything simultaneously. Classrooms are unpredictable places. They're multidimensional places. So what's really, I think, valuable about the quality teaching model is it honours that complexity. And it also is not overly prescriptive. It doesn't say everything has to be present or these things, must be in place. It takes context into account. And so, when you're introducing a new unit of work, teaching may look different than when students are working independently in groups or whatever. It's relevant in every grade or subject. It's affirming for teachers. A lot of teachers say, I thought I was a pretty good teacher, but I've never had feedback of this quality. Like I've never really known. And this has now given me more confidence. And interestingly, we've heard that from really experienced teachers, as well as those who are earlier in their careers. At the same time, of course, it challenges teachers. And you want a bit of challenge there. It's like, well, how do we deliver higher intellectual quality, ensure a quality learning environment, and so on for our students? Importantly, Deloitte's did a cost-benefit analysis, and they found that Quality Teaching Rounds is a really high return, low-cost intervention. In fact, finding that it returns between $40 and $150 to the economy for every dollar invested. In Australia, higher education returns between $3 and $4 to the economy for every dollar invested. So that's based on all of their financial calculations and longer term view. It's not about what principals and leaders in schools immediately see or feel. I guess the issue being that it's an investment that's worthwhile. And we've gone back to schools actually a year later, and we've seen that the improvements in quality teaching have actually even grown further. So it seems to be quite sustainable. In fact, just before I go on to that next slide, one of the favourite statements I've heard from all the teachers I've interviewed over the years was a deputy principal who had been teaching about 20 years in a primary school, a very well-regarded man. He said, "This is the first time in my career I feel I'm actually teaching students. Until now, I've just been giving them work to do." Quite a kind of poignant statement of how this model of teaching gave him a different conception of what it means to teach, and one that's really quite manageable and able to be kind of integrated with his ways of working. This is not about telling teachers to start over or forget what they've been doing and here's a new way. This builds on and relies on what teachers already know and do in ways that teachers actually find quite respectful. So we've done a stack of research on this over the last, nearly 20 years. The first study that we called what we were looking at the implications for the system, the relationship between pedagogy and achievement, and effectively we were just getting a snapshot of what was happening in a whole lot of New South Wales government schools in terms of classroom practice and assessment practice. And basically what we found was there was a lot of room for improvement. It wasn't bad, but on our 1 to 5 scale, we were seeing numbers around between 2.2 and 2.7. And if we could just push those numbers up into the 3s, what kind of difference might it make for student achievement, I guess, was an interesting question. Next we did the study with a small Catholic diocese, and they were interested in how we effectively implement the quality teaching model. And they said, the state department you're working with has 2,200 schools. We've got 66, and we think we could have a really good crack at implementing this effectively. And what we found there, it's where we basically first tried out this process called quality teaching rounds. And we had 8 teachers in a professional learning community, and 7 teachers went and watched one teacher teach a lesson. Next, we had the Australian Capital Territory Department of Ed contact us, and they said, we really like this rounds thing, but there's no way we can release 8 teachers to do quality teaching rounds. If that's the Rolls-Royce model, can we please have a mini minor version? And we didn't really want to dilute our process, but we did design experiments where you hold some things constant and vary others. What we found was no matter how teachers did quality teaching rounds within the parameters of our project, they found it to be a valuable experience. And from that study, we concluded that 4 teachers in a group was optimal. Some teachers did half-day quality teaching rounds. We also concluded that full day was ideal, but half-day was possible. Then the New South Wales Department of Education funded us to do our first randomised controlled trial, looking at the impact of quality teaching rounds on teachers. We wanted to establish that this actually makes a difference for teachers and the quality of their teaching before wanting to make that leap to, does it make a difference for student achievement? We had to establish that, and we found that it did. It improved the quality of teaching, it improved teacher morale. Next, the Paul Ramsay Foundation, which is a big philanthropic foundation here, actually sort of singled us out for funding. We had to go through a big process, but ended up giving us $17.2 million in research funding to do a whole program of activity that we called Building Capacity for Quality Teaching in Australian Schools. It included 4 randomised controlled trials. And they also wanted us to come up with a kind of a business model to try and sustain the initiative after their funding finished, which will happen later this year. So we had to be stretched way beyond our own comfort zones to learn about social enterprises and for impact, not-for-profit enterprises, and how you set that up within a university that's interested in research commercialization, and a whole lot of complexity that has been challenging and exciting. Anyway, just to try and give you some highlights from that body of research, particularly the recent research, we have basically found improvements in the quality of teaching in now 3 separate randomised controlled trials. The first one done in 2014-15, one done in 2019. And in 2021, we did one that was fully online. So teachers never came together physically. The workshops were done online. And 4 teachers from 4 different schools would form a professional learning community. They'd upload their lessons to a secure platform, and they'd have their discussions on Teams or Zoom or whatever. And that was really interesting for the teachers. But we also saw the improvement in teaching quality in that trial. We saw improvements in teacher morale in all 3 of those studies. And we just started with the digital trial to look at the impact on teacher efficacy and found significant improvements in efficacy. In terms of student learning outcomes, I just want to show you the slide before I give a bit of a summary. But we had our control group, and on this dashboard, you can see from term 1 to term 4 of the school year, students grew, their outcomes improved. That's just what happens when kids are at school. The effect was just over 0.4. The students whose teachers participated in quality teaching rounds gained 2 months additional growth in the 8-month period between term 1 and term 4. 2 months additional growth in 8 months, 25% greater growth than the control group in terms of a standardised assessment called progressive achievement tests in maths. We had an alternative group that was given the same funding, the same time, and they did peer observations where, the standard kind of peer observation where we ask teachers to tell us what they want us to focus on today. We take notes on that particular aspect of their teaching. We give them feedback and we talk about refinement. What you see is that those teachers who had the extra time to do this kind of collaborative work their students did make some gains over and above the control group, but nowhere near as much growth as the quality teaching rounds group. So when we look at all of our studies, we've found improvements in maths in the 2019 trial, an improvement in reading in the same trial, but it wasn't statistically significant. And then significant improvements in reading in our digital trial. And we've just had an independent evaluation of quality teaching rounds in Queensland. And they're still just finalising the calculations, but it was a statistically significant effect on reading. So now that accumulation of evidence, we've also seen stronger effects in disadvantaged schools, which, as people who care greatly about our failure to achieve greater equity in Australia over decades now, to see that this might actually be able to help close or narrow at least some of those achievement gaps is really exciting. When we ask teachers in all of the thousands of interviews we've done now, what was the impact of quality teaching rounds? I guess, the word cloud, the bigger the word, the more often it was uttered. The fact that teachers say that things have changed is so powerful because so much professional development doesn't produce change for teacher learning, teaching practice, or student outcomes. But what they tell us is that it's changed how they view their students. It's changed the quality of the work the students they produce. It's changed aspects of their teaching. It's changed their relationships with colleagues or the way they see colleagues. And for some, it's changed their career plans. They were thinking they weren't cut out for teaching or they were over teaching. And this has helped them to see that, in fact, they are very capable and that, I guess that 3-dimensional model helps them kind of find a way forward through all the noise that is out there in the educational world where we try and figure out what do we actually do. If I have a little bit more time, Gavin, I might just quickly touch on this work. Some of you would be familiar with Sam Sims and colleagues' work on mechanisms of effective professional development. And basically, they said there's 4 domains and some, mechanisms that sit under those domains. And this comes from a systematic review of the rigorous literature on effective professional development. It basically says we need to have mechanisms within each of these domains. We've got to build knowledge. We have to motivate teachers. We need to develop actual teaching techniques. And we need to embed that new learning, in practice. And our work was not included in their systematic review because it was published a few months later than their cut-off date. But I've talked with Sam, who said that our work absolutely fits this notion of what they call a balanced design, where you have mechanisms from all 4 of those domains. And importantly, they say if we just build knowledge and motivate people and maybe even develop their teaching skill, but we don't embed it in practice, people will revert to their old ways. If we just build knowledge and motivate people, they might be gung-ho, but not actually know how to do it. How do I achieve that? I mean, as someone who wrote about critical pedagogy in my PhD thesis many decades ago, critical pedagogy effectively implored teachers to do more about achieving justice, social justice, greater equity. But part of my criticism was that it didn't give teachers insights into how they were to go about that. That's a knowing, doing gap. The third one is we might just build knowledge, but then teachers have the lack of motivation. It's all that stuff that misses the point or feels condescending to teachers or, just isn't useful for their needs. We also have other cases where we've motivated teachers, we've developed techniques and embedded them in practice, but they're not founded on good knowledge, or they might be a misunderstanding. I think here about all the work that happened a decade or so ago on learning styles. It was a misunderstanding of how gardeners work on multiple intelligences. But, gung-ho, we were labelling kids as certain kinds of learners and all of that. And of course, at the bottom, we have a balanced design, and that's where we are likely to get more effective PG that actually makes a difference for teachers and for students. I thought I'd just finish quickly by telling you about our Quality Teaching Academy. This is the kind of social enterprise that we've developed. As I said, it's not for profit. And what our aim is, our kind of mission, if you like, is to empower teachers, to empower each other. And the Academy has these functions of really translating all the research we're doing into manageable pieces for teachers and school leaders, to deliver professional development, to provide other supports, to facilitate a broader professional community. Right now, we have a PhD student who's introducing the quality teaching model in Albania. And one of our interests is how translatable this is to other national contexts. We've got interest from a number of other places. And we want to really advocate for the profession. We hear so many negative stories about teachers. Often the media are quick to latch onto the negative and not tell the positive. And what we're trying to do is amass bodies of evidence that help to tell positive stories. For example, we've just pitched to the conversation yesterday about our paper coming out on years of experience to say, stop bagging out initial teacher ed programs and beginning teachers and start supporting all teachers with, what they actually need to be able to deliver high quality teaching throughout their careers. Because the assumption you have that beginning teachers are the problem is not borne up by the evidence on quality teaching. I should just say as an aside there, experienced teachers obviously deliver other benefits for schools that perhaps beginning teachers are not able to do in terms of relationships with families and taking responsibility for timetabling and other leadership functions. But when it comes to the actual classroom practice, that's what we're seeing. Just to give you a sense of, what we're doing at the moment, about 1,200 schools have engaged with our 2-day workshop on quality teaching rounds. That's affected at least 3,200 teachers and at least 400,000 students. The dots represent schools, and there's lots of overlapping schools in there, mostly on the eastern side of Australia. But what we're finding, I guess, is that we can take this to scale. One of the big challenges with a lot of great programs is how do you have them make a difference widely? And that's been a real kind of research interest of this work as well. And we're using implementation science and other things to try and understand how do you implement well and how do you support schools to do that. And I think finally, there's a slide with a few links if you do want to kind of follow up on this work or just stay connected with the work. I'm not very good with all that social media stuff, but thankfully we have people in our team who do look after these things. So I'll just stop sharing. And Gavin, thank you very much for humouring me through quite a long set of slides and a lot of words.
Not at all, Jenny. It was just really insightful into your model of, I suppose, trying to examine quality teaching, promote it, and some really strong evidence about its impact. One of my first questions, I suppose, is in thinking about the quality teaching model between intellectual quality, between the quality learning environment and significance. Which of the three can be maybe the most difficult to achieve, to work with teachers on developing? Does one stand out? Maybe it doesn't. I'm just curious.
No, it actually doesn't. And when we've looked at sort of baseline to follow-up kind of measures, we find improvement across all three dimensions of practice and roughly equivalent improvement as well. So I think in a lot of schools, the idea of intellectual quality is a bit challenging at first. A lot of schools do pretty well in the quality learning environment area. Some subjects do better with significance than others, although it's not sort of always as it might seem. But we see improvement across the board. And I think once teachers get their head around what we mean by intellectual quality, I think it's often the biggest shift in their thinking, because for a lot of teachers, they're used to delivering the curriculum and the sequence of lessons and the sequence of activities, but to think this slightly different way about what it means to teach, which is to make sure we're delivering intellectual quality and so on, is a slightly different but very helpful way of thinking. So, when I ask teachers, what do you want the students to learn? Sometimes they say, these syllabus outcomes or this big idea. And I say, yes, but what do you want them to learn? I want them to learn about rainforests. Well, what do you want them to learn? And it's the intellectual work that teachers do between the syllabus and their students, I think, of translating, the curriculum for their students and making those really important decisions. So, I think once they get their heads around that, it's not difficult. It's intellectually challenging. We do hear teachers at workshops quite often say, my brain hurts from doing the coding and the thinking, but invariably it's really uplifting. It's fascinating, the joy that this seems to create among teachers who so rarely get to do this kind of work that really resonates with them.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about teachers doing analytical work, and I wondered, maybe in thinking about initial teacher education and possibly during practicum or placement during that time, is this something that maybe we should look towards in the future and start building that capacity in teachers from the earliest days in the profession?
I think so. I think right from initial teacher education, we don't have it as embedded in our program even here as I would like to see. But in the last 2 years, we've actually run a 2-day workshop for our final year students just before they go on their final 10-week practicum. And it's really interesting. The data there suggests that it lowers their stress, and increases their confidence for their final placement, and also increases their repertoire and understanding of teaching practices. So we've got some early evidence that it helps there. And the federal government here has just funded us for another big project to look at how this can support the induction phase for beginning teachers, which is really critical, especially now when, attrition rates are really high and shortages in schools are really high. So if we can get people in and feeling supported and comfortable and confident, we're hoping that will really have an impact on attrition rates or retention rates, ideally, a positive impact there.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I was struck by when you were speaking was this precision around language. For example, you talked about PLCs, they're not a synonym for a group. And you also talked about possibly the difference between peer observation, which I've often observed myself. There can be very different conceptions, some of them competing conceptions, versus your particular approach through QTR. So maybe you could just talk to those two terms, peer observation, PLC, often spoken about, but perhaps we need more precision in those terminologies.
Yeah, I think it's precision and it's also substance. I think we've moved away from the, what some have called, I don't particularly like the expression, but the sage on the stage, the one-off inspiring speaker, we still do some of it, towards collaborative forms of in-school professional learning or professional development. And a lot of it is process-driven. We have professional learning communities and they identify things they want to focus on and they focus on them and they're meant to solve the problems. But Pam Grossman did some work that concluded that professional learning communities often take 18 months to reach maturity before they're even speaking the same language and on the same page. I think it's one of the real contributions of our model is it provides this language and set of concepts with which teachers can engage quite quickly. So the evidence, the results we're seeing are with one set of quality teaching rounds. And we don't even think teachers have to do them often. Once a year, once every couple of years, if teachers did a set of rounds, it could make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
I think with peer observation, again, it's often the process of peer observation, but what's the substance of the observation? What are you observing? And I think it's really hit and miss. And the same with instructional rounds, lesson study. Some of these other processes, that they're more process driven, and they often begin with, well, what did you notice? Mm. And we only can think about the things we know about, our common frames of reference. But what the quality teaching model does is really broaden the frame of reference and broaden the noticing, provide the language and the concepts with which to have really powerful professional conversations. And I think that's why we're getting the kind of quick results that we're seeing.
You mentioned Pamela Grossman, whose research has also advocated for more ambitious forms of professional development. And you mentioned the QTR affirms and challenges. Yes. And I wondered if you think that is good for retention at a time where retaining teachers is really difficult. And perhaps in some instances, it's because teachers don't feel stimulated, that they don't get that kind of affirmation.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I think, we need to understand and present teaching as intellectually challenging and rewarding work. And we can't just say that, we have to show it. It kind of goes back to my opening quote. We have to find actual paths of action, that where people can see the evidence that it can be otherwise. And so I think such a way of framing teaching can be part of recruitment into teaching. It's not just looking after kids. It's really important, interesting, challenging work. It's obviously applicable in initial teacher ed, in induction, in ongoing professional learning, and it's important in leadership development as well, especially for the instructional leadership role that is so critical to, really managing and leading a school.
Mm-hmm. I have two final questions, Jenny. One is on the fear of observation that so often might undermine the collective pedagogy you spoke about. So for leaders, what advice could you maybe give them based on your experiences with your program of research about working through the fear of observation that some teachers may have?
Yeah, it's there and it's real, and we understand why it's so, particularly given histories of, inspection and other things that have happened. So we do a lot of work with our model to ensure that we create that really safe environment. So it's only the people in the group who, we say that confidentiality is key, and we talk about trust, and trust is built by delivering on what you say you're going to do. And so, we don't share what happened. We don't go back to the staff room and say, oh, I can't believe Jenny did X or Y. It's about building that safe, trusting environment to do the work. I think with our model, the fact that we have that common touch point and common framework is so important, because teachers are not worried that they're being judged on something they don't care about. For example, the classic, your classroom's really noisy. I think a noisy classroom might be very good for my subject, for my students, for the kind of work we're doing. And so the common frame of reference is something that I think also really enables teachers to overcome that fear. We also ask that the most senior person, or the person with the greatest position of authority, goes first in quality teaching rounds. And if you're a principal and you want to be part of this, you go first. You borrow a class if you need to, and you show that you're willing to expose your teaching in this way and make yourself vulnerable. We find that helps. And finally, we think volunteers help. We always say start small with those who are willing to give it a go. And it becomes quite infectious in schools where teachers say, I want to have a go at that as well. Mm-hmm. A lot of it, I do think, comes back to the model and the processes that we've managed to establish. But I think some of those points that I've made are kind of applicable to other observational processes as well.
Mm-hmm. And finally, Jenny, what are your hopes for the future with your model?
It's a really good question. As I said, the bottom line for me is making a difference and just making, schools and classrooms better for teachers and students, and hopefully achieving the kind of equity and excellence that we talk about as, dual goals of schooling. That's really the bottom line. I suppose my legacy and I'm not, I'm getting older, is to potentially see that this work takes hold, and it's making a difference, and therefore it sticks around for a while, and we see initial teacher ed institutions taking it on. We see it supporting teachers in induction, and we see it embedded in schools, so that it kind of becomes the normal way of thinking about good teaching, and therefore is really helpful to teachers and leaders and students.
Jenny, thanks so much from start to finish today. It's just been really inspiring to hear you speak, and not only inspiring or giving hope, but really also giving us ways and paths to action that you spoke about as well at the early part of this presentation. So thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.